That's debatable because firstly, theoretical international relations and real international relations sometimes have very little to do with each other. That's because I think social scientists try and discern patterns and almost scientific rules in human behaviour. And the more I've been involved, the more I'm convinced it's less about that. It's more about foibles of individual leaders. It's cock-up rather than conspiracy, in my opinion. But it was a good grounding to have. In terms of languages, I'm very typical of a Foreign Office stereotype, which is I arrived with German and Swedish, and I more or less never ever used them at all in over 30 years, while I've been learning several other languages instead. We're trying to make that much more coherent now so that people who come in with valuable languages get to use them. But I basically haven't. The only job you ever have where it's literally a brown envelope and you open it and it tells you, and it's like orders in the military, tells you what to go and do. That the only time you ever have that is your very first job when you join. Afterwards, you're always involved in the process and you can express your preference. But the first one, the brown envelope job, was as a desk officer for Thailand and Laos in Southeast Asia Department. Then I was taught Indonesian, and I had 3 years in the embassy in Indonesia. I was private secretary to the Minister for Europe, someone you may have heard of, called David Davis. I was deputy head of the Drugs and International Crime Department, a growth industry. And then I was head of the Human Rights Department, which was a fantastic job. This was back in a period, it was still the early years of the Blair government. Robin Cook was Foreign Secretary. There was a lot of talk about an ethical foreign policy. And of course, human rights was one area where that was particularly felt, because several controversial issues like arms sales to governments in countries where there were serious human rights issues was widely debated. It was at the forefront of foreign policy. We were looking at issues around the world, both at some of the countries with the worst human rights records in the world, and thematic issues like abolition of the death penalty, prison conditions, women's rights, modern slavery, etc., etc. All issues still highly relevant today. I was ambassador in Chile for 4 and a bit years, and then High Commissioner, which is effectively the same as ambassador in Ghana for just over 3 years. So that's it in brief, and now I'm director of the Foreign Office Diplomatic Academy. Yeah, the Diplomatic Academy is obviously it's part of the Foreign Office, and it's basically our internal school where we teach the basic facets of diplomacy and all the specialist knowledge that people may need according to their job. Not only to the staff of the Foreign Office itself, and not only to the British staff of the Foreign Office, because 2/3 of our staff worldwide are people employed locally in the embassies and consulates around the world. We have about 274 right now in about 165 or more countries. It depends where you are. There often isn't one. In most jobs I've had, quite often something will happen out of left field, unexpected, that blows whatever plans you might have had out of the water. The job I've currently got is a little bit more predictable. London jobs tend to be, although there are a lot of people here who, alongside their day job, are trained in crisis management. We have a big crisis management centre, so you can be sailing along and suddenly something happens. So for example, last year it was all the hurricanes in the Caribbean, including in British overseas territories where we have constitutional responsibility, and suddenly a crisis centre had to be set up. anything can happen like that. So going back to your earlier question about what sort of people we're looking for, being flexible and being able to respond to crises and expecting the unexpected is definitely a core skill that we're looking for. So obviously everyone has their job description, their objectives, and that can indeed be what they're doing for a long time, but they can always expect something completely unexpected to happen. Like, for example, earlier this year, the attack on the Skripals in Salisbury, and for 23 of our colleagues in the embassy in Moscow, that meant the unexpected for them was being asked to leave the country at 7 days' notice. So again, that just shows that though that may be a fairly extreme example, part of being in the diplomatic service is knowing and expecting that almost anything could happen at the drop of a hat. Well, everybody's reality is their own normality ultimately if it goes on for long enough. So you can only prepare for it in general terms and looking at your own resilience and doing the lot of training we offer here in crisis management. But every crisis will be different. So in Chile, for example, at 3:30 on a Saturday morning at a quiet time of the year. It was February, which is the summer holidays in the southern hemisphere. Not a lot going on, a bit like August in the UK, for example. I was suddenly woken up by the 6th largest earthquake in recorded human history. And you have to get on with it. And in that case, that meant finding out how many Brits were involved, what sort of bilateral cooperation we could offer in terms of aid, and expertise, and doing that, starting that from 4 o'clock on a Saturday morning. So that's a personal example. There have been many others, and you never know what it's going to be, but you do know that something like that will happen from time to time during a career like this. It's part of resilience, which again is a core part of our job because of the likelihood of that happening. I think the main thing is to learn. We here try and have a culture that making mistakes is normal. Learn from them, overcoming risk aversion, experimenting, and being very self-aware about what did and didn't work. Yeah, that's one of the big challenges, along with the more prosaic stuff of having to pack up everything you own and ship it off or back every 3 years, which is a great impulse to ditching all the superfluous rubbish that most of us have that we don't need in our lives and in our homes. But again, in terms of recruiting for this sort of job, it's something to think about. People need to welcome that experience, and welcome the experience of having to become an expert in a new area, a new country, a new issue at quite short order. Again, learning languages is a key part of that so that you can insert yourself into a new society and understand it, not just at a linguistic level, but the language helps you understand the culture and the worldview and the thought processes, which are often very different to ours. We offer various courses to help people shortcut that a bit. And then in any embassy you work, it's going to be, as I said before, somewhere above 2/3 of the employees will probably be local staff from that country and that culture who can also help prepare you and explain to you cultural differences, potential cultural misunderstandings, all that sort of thing. But the most important thing is to be open to that, and then you're more likely to learn and adapt quickly. still being alive at this point is arguably an achievement given where I've worked and how I've lived over the years. When I got to Ghana in 2014, almost at the same time the Ebola crisis hit West Africa. It never came to Ghana, but it looked like it was going to come to Ghana. And the government in Ghana shut the airport to flights to the countries that were affected. And through various means, including direct contact and conversations with the president of the country, we had a big role in effectively having that decision overturned, such that only a week later it was the base out of which the UN operated into those countries, which I have no doubt had a very major effect in lessening the crisis and bringing it to an end quicker than otherwise would have happened. That sort of thing I'm proud of, because it's a real life event affecting potentially millions of people across many countries, and that's what diplomacy is for, is government to government contact to collaboratively deal with problems and solve them.